Sleeping Stories.
Beneath the marble spires of the Somerset Isles, behind gilded masks of enlightenment and superiority, lies a doctrine soaked in blood and prophecy. This is not a tale of heroes rising against darkness. This is the story of how darkness convinced itself it was light. This is the story the Thalmor never wanted to tell. Long before the gates of Oblivion tore through reality, before the world burned and the empire crumbled, there existed a society trapped between memory and madness. The Ulmer of Somerset had built their civilization on a foundation of crystalline towers and unshakable certainty. They remembered what their ancestors had been. They remembered the time before mortality, before the prison of flesh, before the betrayal that cast them down from divinity into the mud of the mortal realm. In the waning years of the Third Era, that memory had become a fever. Walk through the streets of Alinor, and you would see perfection rendered in white stone and golden filigree. You would hear the whispered conversations in libraries 10,000 years old, scholars debating genealogies that stretched back to the dawn of time itself. Every family traced their bloodline to the Aldmer, to the Old Ones, to the gods who walked Tamriel before Lorcan the Deceiver trapped them in this diminished existence. But perfection has a way of rotting from within. The High Elves had spent millennia cultivating purity. They had built walls not just of stone but of doctrine, separating themselves from the younger races, the humans who lived and died like mayflies, the beast folk who wallowed in their primitive ways. Yet the walls were cracking. The Septim Empire had extended its reach across the Isles generations ago, bringing with it trade, influence, and the corruption of foreign ideas. Imperial ships docked in First Hold. Human merchants walked streets that should have remained eternally. Mirror, and worst of all, some Altmer had begun to wonder if perhaps the old ways were simply that. This wondering was heresy. This questioning was poison. And in the shadows of every great society, teetering on the edge of change, there are always those who see opportunity in fear. They called themselves the Thalmor in those days, though the name held none of the weight it would later carry. They were academics, politicians, minor nobles with grand ambitions and ancient grudges. They gathered in private chambers and spoke of what had been stolen from their people. They studied texts that others had deemed too dangerous, too obsessive, too consumed with the impossible dream of reclaiming godhood. They looked at the empire and saw not strength, but contamination. They looked at their own people and saw complacency, weakness, a willingness to forget. The tragedy of Somerset in those final years of the Third Era was not that evil took root there. It was that righteousness did. These were not demons scheming in darkness. They were men who believed with absolute conviction that they were saving their people from extinction. They believed that mortal life was a cage, that death was an aberration, that somewhere in the ancient magics and forgotten rituals lay the key to undoing Lorcan's great crime against their ancestors. They believed that any sacrifice, any amount of blood spilled, any level of control imposed was justified if it led back to the stars. The rest of Tamriel paid little attention to the internal politics of the Somerset Isles. The Empire was concerned with Morrowind, with the growing tensions in Skyrim, with maintaining its grip on a continent that had never truly been unified. The Ulmer had always been strange, insular, obsessed with their superiority. Let them argue among themselves in their island fortress. What harm could their philosophy do to a world protected by dragonborn emperors and the blessings of the divines? That indifference would prove costly beyond measure. Because in the beautiful halls of Alinor, in the meditation chambers of the Crystal Tower, in gatherings that grew larger and more fervent with each passing season, a movement was building that would not stop at the shores of Somerset. They had a vision of the world reborn. They had a plan that spanned centuries, and they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The world did not yet know the name. Thalmor meant anything beyond an old word for a governing council. But it would learn, by blood and fire, and the breaking of nations, it would learn. The year was 433 of the Third Era when the sky split open above Tamriel. Mehrunes Dagon, the Prince of Destruction, had found his way past the barriers between Oblivion and Mundus. Gates manifested across the continent, tearing through reality like wounds in flesh, spilling forth legions of Daedra that existed only to unmake everything mortals had built. The Empire mobilized its legions. The Mages Guild scrambled to understand what was happening. And in Somerset, the world that the Altmer had so carefully controlled began to burn. The Oblivion Gates appeared across the Isles without warning or mercy. One moment, a fishing village on the southern coast watched the sunset paint the ocean gold. The next, a tower of twisted metal and screaming stone erupted in the town square, and creatures that should not exist poured into streets where children had been playing moments before. The same scene repeated in Cloudrest, in Shimmerine, in settlements that had stood for 3,000 years without knowing war. Fire consumed libraries that contained the accumulated wisdom of ages. Daedric weapons tore through silk and flesh with equal ease. The dead piled in numbers that made mockery of Altmer's certainty about their place in creation. The Imperial Legion garrison in Somerset fought with desperate courage and failed with spectacular completeness. There were simply not enough soldiers, not enough resources, not enough time to mount an adequate defense against an invasion that defied all conventional military doctrine. Legionnaires died, buying time for evacuations that saved some but never enough. The commanders sent urgent requests to Cyrodiil for reinforcements that would arrive too late or not at all. The Empire, it became horrifically clear, could not protect its most distant provinces when reality itself was under assault. Into this chaos stepped those who had been preparing for something, though perhaps not this. The Thalmor, still a minor political faction in the official hierarchy, moved with surprising coordination. They had connections throughout the Isles. They had resources stockpiled for purposes they had never quite explained, and they had something the traditional nobility and the panicking imperial administrators did not have in that moment of crisis. They had absolute certainty about what needed to be done. They organized militias when the Legion could not respond fast enough. They evacuated refugees using ships. They seemed to have ready for exactly this purpose. They led assaults on Oblivion Gates, using techniques drawn from old texts, ancient Aldmeri magic that had been deemed too dangerous or too dark for general use. Whether these methods actually worked, or whether they simply took credit for Gates closing due to events unfolding in Cyrodiil, would become a matter of bitter historical debate. But in the moment, in the blood and fire and terror of those days, people saw Thalmor agents standing between them and annihilation while Imperial soldiers lay dead in the streets. When Martin Septim lit the dragon fires and became the avatar of Akatosh, when the barriers between Oblivion and Mundus sealed shut once more, and the crisis ended as suddenly as it had begun, Somerset was left traumatized and transformed. The dead numbered in the tens of thousands. Entire communities had been erased. The psychological wound went even deeper than the physical devastation. The Ulmer had believed themselves chosen, protected, superior. They had built their entire identity on the idea that they were closest to the divine, and the gods had let them burn. The traditional government struggled to respond to the aftermath. The bureaucracy that had maintained order for centuries proved utterly inadequate to coordinate rebuilding on the necessary scale. Nobles argued about whose estates should be restored first, while people starved in refugee camps. The imperial administration offered aid that felt like insult, gold and grain from human lands, to feed elves who had convinced themselves they needed nothing from lesser races. Every well-meaning gesture from the empire reinforced the narrative that Somerset had become dependent, weakened, reduced to accepting charity from mortals who barely understood the concept of civilization. The Thalmor told a different story. They spoke in town squares and refugee shelters. They wrote pamphlets that circulated through camps where the displaced tried to rebuild lives from ash. They asked questions that seemed reasonable in the grief and anger of the moment. Where was the Legion when the gates opened? Why did the Empire leave Somerset to stand alone? Who actually closed those gates and saved your families? The traditional leaders spoke of maintaining unity with Cyrodiil. The Thalmor spoke of pride, of self-reliance, of a future where Altmer answered to no one but themselves. The coup happened so quickly that later historians would argue whether it could even be called a coup. The old nobility simply found themselves irrelevant. Key officials who might have organized resistance disappeared during night operations attributed to lingering Daedra cultists. Others accepted positions in the new order, rather than face exile or worse. Within 2 years of the Oblivion Crisis ending, the Thalmor had transformed from political activists into the unquestioned authority over Somerset. They called it liberation. Many exhausted, traumatized Alper called it salvation. Those who called it tyranny learned very quickly to remain silent. The Third Aldmeri Dominion was declared in the year 4E22, 22 years into the new era. The Thalmor presented it as a return to ancient glory, a restoration of the dominion that had once united Somerset, Valenwood, and elsewhere under enlightened Mer leadership. They promised a future where Altmer would never again depend on human empires for their security. They promised a civilization built on the old principles, the true principles, the understanding that Mer were meant for something greater than integration into the empire of man. But promises made in public squares tell only part of any story. Behind the golden facades of the new government buildings, the Thalmor began implementing a vision of society that would have seemed extreme even to their earlier selves. Lists were compiled of those who had spoken against them, who had supported continued imperial ties, who had expressed doubts about the new direction. Some names on those lists were never heard from again. Others appeared at public rallies, reciting prepared statements about their past errors and newfound understanding. Fear became the unspoken foundation beneath every pronouncement about Altmer glory. The restructuring of Somerset society followed patterns that would be repeated later in Valenwood and elsewhere. Education was reformed to emphasize Thalmor doctrine. Children learned that the Oblivion Crisis had proven the empire worthless. They learned that the old nobility had been weak, corrupted by centuries of human influence. They learned that the way forward required absolute unity, absolute commitment to the restoration of Aldmeri supremacy. Teachers who suggested nuance in these matters found their positions filled by those more ideologically reliable. History itself was rewritten with systematic efficiency. The texts that documented imperial contributions to Somerset over the centuries were removed from libraries or edited to emphasize exploitation rather than cooperation. Records suggesting that Legion soldiers had fought bravely during the crisis became difficult to find. The story simplified, purified, transformed into something useful. The Thalmor had stood alone and triumphed through ancient Aldmeri magic. The Empire had failed. These were the only facts that mattered now. Valenwood fell into the Dominion through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and outright supernatural manipulation. The Bosmer had their own complicated relationship with civilization and authority. Their green pact bound them to the forest in ways outsiders struggled to comprehend. The Thalmor came offering protection, trade agreements, and barely veiled threats about what might happen if the Wood Elves chose isolation. They spoke of mere unity against the human tide. They reminded Valenwood of ancient alliances, and when words proved insufficient, they reminded them of the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt is horror beyond human comprehension, a transformation of Bosmer into something primal and unstoppable that has erased entire armies from existence. Exactly what role the Thalmor played in certain incidents along the borders remains unclear. What is documented is that settlements resisting integration experienced tragedies attributed to wild hunts that defenders of the Green Pact insist were impossible given the circumstances. Whether the Thalmor somehow triggered these events or simply exploited the fear they generated, the result was the same. Valenwood joined the Dominion with far less resistance than military analysts had predicted possible. Elsewhere required a different approach. The Khajiit are proud, independent, and deeply spiritual people who had no particular reason to submit to Altmer authority. The Thalmor understood that military conquest of the desert provinces would be costly and might not even succeed, given the terrain and the Khajiit capacity for asymmetric warfare. So they turned to their growing expertise in manipulating reality itself in ways most mortals could barely comprehend. In the year 4E98, both of Tamriel's moons vanished from the night sky. Masser and Secunda, the eternal companions that governed Khajiit religion, culture, and even the forms their bodies took, simply ceased to exist. For 2 years the night sky remained empty where the moons should have been. For the Khajiit, this was apocalypse without end. Their entire civilization was built on lunar cycles. Kittens, born during the void nights, took forms determined by chance rather than the moon phase of their birth. Priests had no explanation. The man, their spiritual leader, could offer no comfort. The world had broken in a way that suggested the gods themselves had abandoned elsewhere. Then, in 4E100, the moons returned. They appeared in the sky exactly where they should be, as though they had never left, and the Thalmor claimed credit for their restoration. They told the Khajiit that ancient Alpar magic, techniques lost since the Merithic era, had been used to pull the moons back from wherever they had gone. They claimed to have saved Khajiit civilization from permanent collapse. There was no proof. There could be no proof of something so cosmically vast. But desperate people accept the explanations offered by those who claim to have saved them. Within a decade, Elsewhere had joined the Dominion under client-state status that looked remarkably like subjugation once examined closely. The Khajiit maintained nominal independence and internal governance, but Thalmor advisors now walked the halls of power in Rimmon and Liaoui. Trade flowed according to terms that favored Somerset. Military cooperation was mandatory, and anyone who questioned whether the Thalmor had actually done anything to restore the moons found themselves accused of ungrateful heresy. The Third Aldmeri Dominion now controlled a massive territory spanning the southern and western regions of Tamriel. 3 distinct Meri and Merelite cultures had been brought under a single authority through methods ranging from political pressure to supernatural terrorism. The bureaucratic apparatus to govern this new empire was constructed with terrifying efficiency. Thalmor administrators developed systems of control that allowed a relatively small number of true believers to govern millions who ranged from enthusiastic supporters to deeply resentful subjects. Surveillance became normalized. Citizens were encouraged to report neighbors who spoke against the Dominion or expressed nostalgia for the days of imperial rule. The reports were investigated. Some proved baseless. Others resulted in arrests that happened in the dark hours before dawn. People learned that private conversations had a way of becoming public knowledge. They learned that trust was dangerous. They learned that the safest path was visible enthusiasm for whatever the Thalmor proclaimed as necessary for the greater good of Mer civilization. The camps in Valenwood, where dissidents were sent for re-education, were officially described as facilities for political instruction and cultural alignment. Former inmates, who emerged after months or years, declined to discuss what the instruction involved. The mass grave discovered in the northern Sylvanar forest years later suggested that not everyone completed their education successfully. Official Thalmor documentation attributed the bodies to Imperial sympathizers killed during the integration period. The fact that some showed signs of torture and execution rather than combat injuries raised questions that no one with authority chose to investigate. The Empire watched these developments with growing alarm, but found itself paralyzed by internal problems and strategic limitations. Cyrodiil was dealing with its own succession crises and economic troubles. The distance to Somerset made military intervention logistically nightmarish, and the Thalmor had been careful to frame their expansion as internal Meris affairs, reunification rather than conquest. When Imperial diplomats raised concerns about reported atrocities, Thalmor representatives expressed polite confusion about these alleged incidents and invited inspectors to visit facilities that had been prepared specifically for such inspections. By 4E168, the Aldmeri Dominion had solidified its control over its territory and began looking outward with ambitions that would remake the political map of Tamriel. They had built a society where dissent was impossible, where history was whatever they declared it to be, where entire populations had been taught that Thalmor rule was both natural and inevitable. They had proven their willingness to use any method, any level of deception, any amount of violence to achieve their goals, and they had convinced themselves that what they were building was not tyranny but destiny. The stage was set for the war that would burn half the world and never truly end. Even after the fighting stopped, the pieces were in position. The ideological justification had been perfected. All that remained was finding the right moment to strike at the heart of the Empire itself and demonstrate once and for all that the Age of Man was finished. That moment came with a declaration delivered to the Imperial City on the last day of 4E168. The ultimatum was precise and impossible. Disband the Blades, outlaw the worship of Talos, cede significant territory to Dominion control, acknowledge Ulper's supremacy in all matters of magical and theological doctrine. The terms were designed to be rejected. The Thalmor wanted war. They needed war. And on the 28th day of Rain's Hand in 4E171, they got it. The Great War began with coordinated strikes across multiple fronts that caught the Empire catastrophically unprepared. Dominion forces swept through Hammerfell and crossed into Cyrodiil with speed that suggested years of planning. Their intelligence on Imperial defenses was perfect. Their targeting of supply lines and communication networks was surgical. Within months, they had pushed deeper into Imperial territory than any foreign army had managed in centuries. The Legion fought with courage and desperation. It was not enough. The advance on the Imperial City represented the apex of Thalmor military power and the depths of their brutality. The siege lasted through the winter of 4E173 and into spring. Citizens starved as supply lines were cut. The Dominion brought up siege weapons and mages that turned sections of the outer walls to rubble and molten stone. When the breakthrough finally came, the slaughter that followed erased any pretense that this was a civilized war, fought for political objectives. For 30 days, the Aldmeri Dominion occupied the Imperial City. What happened during that month would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives and poison any possibility of reconciliation between the Empire and the Dominion for generations to come. The Thalmor did not simply hold the city, they desecrated it. Every shrine to Talos was destroyed with methodical fury. The Temple of the One became a torture chamber where captured Blades agents were interrogated using techniques that reduced experienced warriors to broken shells begging for death. The civilian population suffered treatment designed to break spirits as thoroughly as bodies. Public executions were staged in the market squares for crimes as minor as possession of Talos amulets. The Thalmor wanted the Empire to understand that defeat would mean not just political subjugation, but cultural annihilation. They wanted fear embedded so deeply that even thinking of resistance would become impossible. They occupied the Imperial City like a boot on a throat and pressed down with everything they had. Titus Mede II had fled before the city fell, a pragmatic decision that his critics would never forgive and that probably saved the Empire from complete collapse. He regrouped the surviving Legion forces north of the city and began planning a counter-offensive with generals who understood they were fighting for survival rather than victory. The Battle of the Red Ring was the result of that planning, a desperate gambit to retake the capital before the Empire fragmented completely. The battle lasted for days and consumed lives by the thousands on both sides. Imperial forces surrounded the city and assaulted from multiple directions simultaneously. Dominion defenders fought with the fanaticism of those who believed they were manifesting divine will. The streets of the Imperial City became abattoirs where merds and men killed each other over every building and intersection. When the Dominion forces finally broke and retreated, it was less decisive victory than mutual exhaustion. The Empire had retaken its capital, but the cost had been staggering. The Legion was shattered. Entire cohorts had been annihilated. The chain of command had been decimated at every level. Hammerfell was still occupied. Cyrodiil itself was devastated, and the Dominion, despite its defeat at the Red Ring, still held enough territory and enough intact forces that pushing them completely out of Imperial lands would have required years of additional fighting that the Empire simply did not have the resources to sustain. The White Gold Concordat, signed in 4E 175, and represented the Thalmor achieving through diplomacy what they had failed to secure through complete military victory. The terms were nearly identical to the ultimatum that had started the war. The Blades were officially disbanded. The worship of Talos was banned throughout Imperial territory. Substantial portions of Hammerfell were ceded to the Dominion, and most significantly, the Thalmor gained the legal authority to send justiciars into Imperial provinces to enforce the Talos ban through any means they deemed necessary. Titus Mede II signed the treaty because the alternative was watching the Empire collapse entirely. His generals knew it. His advisors knew it. But the citizens who had endured occupation and the soldiers who had fought and died at the Red Ring saw only betrayal. The Emperor had surrendered to the same enemy they had just driven from the capital. He had given the Thalmor permission to operate with impunity on Imperial soil. He had outlawed the worship of the god who had been a man, the god who represented the possibility that mortals could ascend to something greater. The Dominion celebrated the Concordat as total victory despite the military stalemate. They had proven that the Empire could be beaten. They had demonstrated their willingness to absorb catastrophic losses in pursuit of ideological goals. They had extracted concessions that would poison Imperial society for decades. And most importantly, they had positioned themselves to continue their war by other means, using Imperial law itself as a weapon to tear apart the nations they had failed to conquer outright. The justiciars arrived in Imperial provinces within months of the Concordat being signed. They wore hooded robes and carried documents granting them authority over local law enforcement in matters related to Talos worship. They established headquarters that soon became feared more than any legion garrison. They had the power to arrest, interrogate, and execute without needing approval from imperial courts or governors. They were the visible manifestation of defeat, walking evidence that the Empire had submitted to foreign domination. In Skyrim especially, the arrival of Thalmor justiciars ignited resentment that had been building since the moment the Concordat was announced. The Nords had always held Talos in special reverence. He had been Tiber Septim, a man who conquered an empire. He had been Ysmir, the dragon of the north. His ascension to godhood was proof that the barriers between mortal and divine were not as absolute as the Thalmor claimed. Taking away Talos worship from the Nords was like trying to extract their identity and replace it with submission. The justiciars went about their work with bureaucratic ruthlessness. They investigated reports of shrines maintained in private homes. They questioned citizens about their religious practices. They arrested priests who continued to offer prayers to the ninth divine. The interrogations that followed these arrests took place in facilities that prisoners entered but often did not leave. Those who did emerge carried scars and spoke of techniques designed to break faith as thoroughly as bones. The torture chambers, operated by the Thalmor in Skyrim and other provinces during the years following the Great War, remain some of the most damning evidence of what the Dominion truly represented beneath its rhetoric of enlightenment. The justiciars did not simply punish Talos worshippers. They studied them. They experimented with methods to destroy religious conviction. They kept detailed records of what worked to make someone renounce their gods. The documentation recovered from sites like Northwatch Keep revealed minds that approached the destruction of faith as a science requiring peer review and iterative improvement. The Great War had ended according to the documents and treaties. But anyone living in imperial territory under Thalmor oversight understood that peace was simply war by another name. The Dominion was using the breathing space to rebuild its forces. The Empire was desperately trying to recover from wounds that might prove fatal. And in the space between exhausted empires, new conflicts were emerging that would serve Thalmor interests perfectly, while costing them nothing at all. The Markarth incident of 4E 176 began as a local uprising and transformed into the spark that would set Skyrim ablaze for decades. During the chaos of the Great War, a group of Nord nationalists, led by Ulfric Stormcloak, had retaken the Reach from the forsworn natives, who had claimed it during imperial weakness. When the war ended and the Concordat was signed, these same Nords found themselves in an impossible position. They had fought for the Empire. They had reclaimed imperial territory, and now that same Empire was telling them their worship of Talos was criminal. Ulfric Stormcloak made demands that seemed reasonable to anyone who had not read the terms of the White Gold Concordat carefully. He wanted recognition for what his militia had accomplished. He wanted the right to continue Talos worship openly in the holds they had liberated. The Empire, desperate to maintain control of Skyrim and bound by treaty obligations to the Thalmor, tried to negotiate a middle ground that satisfied no one. The Thalmor, observing from their embassy outside Solitude, saw opportunity crystallizing before their eyes. What happened next remains disputed, depending on who tells the story. Imperial records suggest Ulfric was allowed free Talos worship briefly, as an unofficial compromise that the Thalmor then discovered and demanded be reversed. Stormcloak loyalists claim the Empire betrayed promises made in blood. Thalmor documentation captured much later suggests something more calculated. They had pushed the Empire to crack down specifically because they wanted to create a martyr and needed the Nords divided against themselves. Ulfric was arrested for Talos worship. His militia was disbanded, The Thalmor justiciars were given jurisdiction over Markarth to ensure compliance with the Concordat. For the Nords who had fought to reclaim that city, the message was unmistakable. Your service means nothing. Your god is illegal. Your choice is submission or suffering. The anger that erupted in response was exactly what the carefully orchestrated humiliation had been designed to produce. The Stormcloak Rebellion began not as a war, but as a series of protests and refusals to cooperate with Imperial authorities who were seen as Thalmor puppets. It escalated when Imperial soldiers tried to suppress gatherings where Talos was being openly worshipped. It exploded into open warfare when Ulfric Stormcloak killed High King Torrig in single combat, a traditional Nord challenge that was legally justified under ancient custom, but politically catastrophic for any hope of unity. The Thalmor watched the civil war spread across Skyrim, with satisfaction that they barely bothered to hide. Their internal communications, later discovered by those with access to their embassy records, revealed strategic thinking that was brilliant in its cruelty. They did not want either side to win. They wanted the war to continue indefinitely, bleeding both Imperial and Stormcloak forces, consuming resources that might otherwise be used to prepare for the inevitable Second Great War, turning Nords against each other with hatred that would take generations to heal if it healed at all. The dossier on Ulfric Stormcloak himself told a story more tragic than any propaganda from either side acknowledged. He had been captured during the Great War. He had been interrogated in Thalmor facilities. What happened during that interrogation remained classified in Dominion archives, but the psychological assessment was clear enough. Ulfric had been broken and rebuilt as an asset, though he likely did not understand the extent of his manipulation. His rebellion served Thalmor interests perfectly, while he believed he was fighting for Nordic freedom. The genius of the strategy was that it did not require Ulfric to be a conscious traitor. He genuinely believed in his cause. He genuinely hated the Thalmor. But his actions, his timing, his choices all aligned with what the Dominion needed to keep the Empire weak and divided. He was a weapon aimed at Imperial stability, and the trigger had been pulled years before in a torture chamber that had left scars deeper than those visible on flesh. Every battle of the Skyrim Civil War was a victory for the Aldmeri Dominion, regardless of which side held the field. When the fighting ended, Whiterun burned, and both Imperial and Stormcloak soldiers died defending and attacking it. The Thalmor casualty count remained 0. Fort Dunstad changed hands 3 times in as many years, and each exchange cost dozens of Nord lives. The Thalmor continued their investigations of Talos worship with complete impunity. Windhelm and Solitude prepared for sieges that would devastate whichever city fell. The Thalmor embassy remained untouched, its officials watching the bloodshed with a detachment of scholars observing an experiment. The presence of Thalmor justiciars operating freely in Skyrim while Nords killed each other over how to resist those same Thalmor was irony sharp enough to draw blood. They maintained facilities like Northwatch Keep, where suspected Talos worshippers were detained and interrogated. They patrolled roads with armed escorts, stopping travelers to check for contraband religious materials. They had the legal authority to override local jarls, to demand cooperation from Imperial officials, to arrest and imprison citizens of Skyrim on Skyrim soil, and face no consequences for whatever happened in their custody. The stories that emerged from those who survived Thalmor detention painted pictures of systematic cruelty refined over years of practice. The justiciars had developed techniques for extracting information and destroying will that went beyond simple torture. They understood how to make someone betray everything they believed, how to turn faith into weakness that could be exploited. Some victims emerged as hollow shells who would confess to anything to avoid returning. Others simply disappeared into the network of Thalmor prisons that extended from Skyrim back to facilities in Dominion territory, where no imperial oversight existed at all. The Thalmor goal in Skyrim was never military victory. It was entropy. They wanted exhaustion, demoralization, permanent division between Nords who should have been united against external threats. They wanted the Legion bleeding out, trying to hold territory against an insurgency that would never fully end. They wanted Ulfric Stormcloak convinced he was fighting for freedom, while actually serving as the most effective weapon in the Dominion arsenal. And they wanted every Nord who survived the Civil War to remember that their suffering could be traced back to the White Gold Concordat and the empire that had signed it. The psychological warfare embedded in this strategy demonstrated sophistication that most military theorists would study for centuries afterward. The Thalmor were not just fighting the empire. They were dismantling the conceptual foundations that held it together. They were proving that even when the Dominion lost battles, they could win wars through patience and understanding how to make their enemies destroy themselves. Yet beneath the political maneuvering and strategic brilliance of keeping Skyrim divided lay something far more disturbing. The Thalmor were not simply engaged in conventional imperialism with better tactics. Their ultimate goals went beyond controlling territory or subjugating populations. What they sought was metaphysical in nature, cosmic in scope, and apocalyptic in consequence. To understand what the Thalmor truly wanted required looking past their political rhetoric and examining beliefs so extreme that even many within their own ranks did not fully grasp the implications. The towers, across Tamriel, stand structures of immense magical significance, anchors that bind reality together and maintain the barriers between Mundus and Oblivion, between mortal existence and the chaos that churns beyond it. Some are physical buildings, like the White Gold Tower in the Imperial City. Others are more abstract, conceptual constructs given form through belief and power. The Snowthroat in Skyrim, the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfiera, Red Mountain in Morrowind. These were not simply landmarks, but linchpins holding creation in place. The Thalmor had studied these towers with obsessive intensity. Their scholars had plunged into texts from the Merithic era, deciphering references in languages so old that translating them required magical as well as linguistic expertise. What they discovered was a theory about creation itself, about how the Mundus was constructed, and more importantly, how it might be deconstructed. If the towers were what maintained reality, then destroying enough of them would cause reality to collapse back into the primordial state that existed before convention, before Lorkhan bound the spirits into mortal forms. This was the secret beating heart of Thalmor ideology that even many of their own supporters did not fully understand. The suppression of Talis worship was not simply religious persecution or political domination. Talis, as the ninth divine, represented a tower in himself, a mortal who had achieved divinity and thereby reinforced the permanence of the mortal realm. By erasing him from worship, by eliminating the belief that sustained his divine existence, the Thalmor hoped to topple that tower and weaken the foundations of reality itself. The ban on the Thum, the ancient voice that Ulfric had used to kill the High King, was connected to the same theory. The way of the voice represented a fundamental aspect of how Nirn functioned, tied to the dragon language and the forces that shaped reality during convention. By suppressing it, by making its use illegal and hunting down those who practiced it, the Thalmor sought to erode another aspect of what held creation together. Their ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete unmaking of Mundus. They believed that mortal existence was a prison, that the Altmer had once been spirits of pure divine essence before Lorkhan the trickster trapped them in flesh and bone and death. They wanted to reverse creation itself, to shatter the prison of mortality, and return to the state their ancestors had occupied before time began. And if that meant destroying the world and everything in it, if it meant genocide on a cosmic scale, They considered it not just acceptable but necessary. The terrifying aspect of this doctrine was that they might actually be capable of achieving it. The Thalmor were not delusional cultists chasing impossible fantasies. They were among the most magically sophisticated people on Tamriel, with access to knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. They had political control of a massive territory, giving them resources to pursue long-term projects without oversight. They had demonstrated willingness to commit atrocities in service of their ideology without hesitation or remorse, and the evidence suggested they had already taken steps toward their goal. Red Mountain had erupted in 4E5, destroying Vavardenfell and crippling Morrowind. Whether this was natural disaster or Thalmor interference remained unclear, but the timing was suspicious. The Red Tower had been one of the most powerful reality anchors. Its destruction had consequences that rippled across the fabric of reality in ways most mortals never perceived, but that Thalmor mages would have been monitoring intently. The Crystal Tower on Somerset had been damaged or destroyed at some point, though exact details were classified in Dominion records, and anyone asking too many questions about what happened tended to disappear. This was literally in the Thalmor heartland, under their complete control. If they had sabotaged one of the towers, that one would have been the easiest target and the clearest signal of their intentions. The White Gold Tower itself had been occupied by Thalmor forces during the Great War. What rituals or workings they might have performed during those 30 days remained unknown, but they had brought some of their most powerful mages into the Imperial City, and those mages had not spent their time simply supporting military operations. Something had been done to the tower. Imperial scholars who examined it afterward reported subtle changes in the magical resonances, though whether these constituted permanent damage was debated. The Thalmor were playing a game measured in centuries, while everyone else thought in terms of decades. They could afford to lose battles, even lose wars, as long as each loss brought them closer to the conditions necessary to bring down the remaining towers. They needed the world divided, weakened, unable to coordinate against them. They needed religious and magical traditions that reinforced reality to be suppressed or destroyed. They needed the people of Tamriel exhausted and demoralized so that when the final crisis came, there would be no unified resistance. The Sigic Order understood what the Thalmor were attempting. The monks of Artaeum had their own deep knowledge of metaphysics and could read the signs as clearly as anyone. But they were small in number, politically isolated, and lacked the military power to directly oppose the Dominion. They could advise, warn, work in shadows, but they could not stop an empire backed by millions of subjects and willing to sacrifice all of them to achieve transcendence. Other scholars and mages across Tamriel who glimpsed pieces of the Thalmor plan faced similar constraints. Speaking too openly about apocalyptic conspiracy theories invited dismissal as paranoid or insane. Presenting evidence to authorities who were already overwhelmed with immediate crises like the Civil War resulted in polite acknowledgement and no action. And those who pushed too hard on investigating Thalmor metaphysical activities tended to have accidents or disappear before they could share their findings. The genius and horror of the Tower theory was that even if people understood it, stopping the Thalmor from pursuing it required preventing them from doing things that seemed reasonable from a conventional warfare perspective. Of course they wanted to control the White Gold Tower. It was the imperial capital. Of course they suppressed Talos worship. He represented their enemy's ideology. Of course they promoted policies that divided and weakened human kingdoms. That was basic geopolitics. The apocalyptic implications remained hidden beneath layers of mundane explanation. The Thalmor themselves existed in a state of cognitive compartmentalization about their ultimate goals. The average justiciar torturing a Talos worshipper in Skyrim likely believed they were enforcing treaty compliance and suppressing dangerous imperial ideology. They might know vaguely about Altmer religious doctrine concerning lost divinity. They probably did not understand that their daily work was part of a centuries-long conspiracy to literally end reality as it currently existed. Even among the higher ranks of Thalmor leadership, full knowledge of the Tower Theory and its implications was restricted to inner circles. Many influential Thalmor were true believers in Altmer supremacy and the restoration of Mer dominance over Tamriel, without necessarily understanding that the ultimate goal was destroying Tamriel entirely. The inner circle let them believe they were building an empire, when actually they were building the mechanism for universal annihilation. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It maintained operational security by limiting how many people knew enough to expose the full plan. It allowed the Thalmor to recruit supporters motivated by conventional nationalism rather than apocalyptic mysticism. And it created layers of deniability where even captured Thalmor agents could not reveal what they genuinely did not know. But organizations built on secrets and compartmentalization carry inherent instabilities. Not everyone who joined the Thalmor cause in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis had signed up for cosmic genocide. Some had genuinely believed they were saving Altmer culture from imperial assimilation. Others had been motivated by personal ambition, seeing opportunities for advancement in the New Order. As the Dominion consolidated power and the true extent of Thalmor radicalism became harder to hide, cracks began appearing in the facade of unity. There were Altmer within Somerset, who remembered the Third Era with something other than hatred. They had lived through centuries of relative peace under imperial administration. They had built lives, raised families, pursued scholarship in environments that were stable and prosperous. The coup that brought the Thalmor to absolute power had destroyed that world and replaced it with something they barely recognized. These dissidents could not speak openly without inviting arrest, or worse. The surveillance networks that the Thalmor had built across Somerset meant private conversations had a dangerous tendency to become known to authorities. But resistance took forms that totalitarian systems always struggle to completely suppress. Minor acts of non-compliance, deliberate inefficiency in implementing directives, quiet warnings passed to those targeted for investigation, help offered to families whose members had disappeared into the prison system. The Thalmor response to even whispered dissent was calibrated to maintain control through fear, without triggering open rebellion. Suspected dissidents were watched closely, their movements tracked, their communications intercepted. Some were pulled in for questioning sessions, designed to intimidate without leaving marks that would create martyrs. Others simply vanished, their disappearances attributed to personal decisions, to relocate or tragic accidents that no one could quite disprove. The camps where political prisoners were sent for re-education operated under bureaucratic language that hid their true nature. They were called institutes for cultural realignment or facilities for ideological development. Former inmates, who were released after demonstrating proper attitude toward Thalmor doctrine, rarely spoke about their experiences. The few who did described systematic psychological torture, forced renunciation of previous beliefs, and sessions where they were required to report on the loyalty of fellow prisoners as tests of their own rehabilitation. Among the Thalmor hierarchy itself, tensions existed between factions with different priorities and methods. The military officers who had actually fought the Great War understood the costs of total warfare in ways that political theorists did not. They had seen entire units annihilated at the Red Ring. They knew the Dominion forces were strong, but not invincible. They advocated for patience, for rebuilding military strength, before risking another major conflict with the Empire. The ideological purists who dominated the civilian administration had less patience for strategic caution. They believed their cause was divinely mandated, and that showing weakness or hesitation betrayed everything they claimed to represent. They pushed for aggressive expansion, for tightening control over subject populations, for accelerating the timeline toward confrontation, regardless of military readiness. These tensions played out in policy debates that could become quite heated behind closed doors, even as public unity was maintained. Individual Thalmor agents experienced their own crises of faith as the realities of their work accumulated. The Justicia, who had joined believing they would be protecting Altmer interests, found themselves torturing farmers for possessing Talos amulets. The mage who had studied tower theory as abstract magical philosophy confronted implications that their research was contributing to plans for universal destruction. The administrator, who had wanted to build a better society, realized the bureaucracy they served existed primarily to enable atrocities. Some of these individuals became disillusioned and sought ways out. Defecting from the Thalmor was nearly impossible, given their intelligence networks and reach. Those who tried often did not survive the attempt. But information occasionally leaked through intermediaries, through diplomatic contacts, through agents who maintained secret connections with family members outside the power structure. The Blades in exile, what remained of them, received occasional tips from sources within the Dominion who remained anonymous for obvious reasons. The Thalmor dealt with internal dissent through a combination of surveillance, selective punishment, and ideological reinforcement. Regular sessions of doctrinal education reminded members what they were fighting for and why compromise was betrayal. Success stories were publicized, examples of how Thalmor dedication had achieved results. Failures were attributed to insufficient commitment or contamination by foreign ideas. The message was clear. Doubt was weakness. Unity was survival. The cause was everything. Yet, maintaining this level of control required resources and attention that might otherwise go toward external operations. The Thalmor had to garrison their own territory, not just against foreign threats, but against their own populations. They had to monitor their own ranks for signs of wavering loyalty. They had to balance expansion against consolidation, aggression against sustainability. These were problems that all authoritarian systems eventually face, though the Thalmor were more effective at managing them than most. The irony was that the very qualities that made the Thalmor dangerous also contained seeds of their potential downfall. The absolute certainty that made them willing to commit any atrocity also made them brittle when confronted with evidence that their certainty might be misplaced. The compartmentalization that protected their secrets also meant different factions within their own ranks often worked at cross purposes. The fear that kept subject populations compliant also bred resentment that would erupt given the right catalyst. Hammerfell had proven that the Dominion could be resisted successfully. After the White Gold Concordat ceded significant Redguard territory to Thalmor control, the Redguards simply refused to accept the terms. They formally broke with the Empire rather than submit, and then proceeded to fight a grinding defensive campaign that eventually expelled Dominion forces from their lands. It cost them dearly in lives and resources. But they won. They proved the Thalmor were not invincible. The Thalmor narrative carefully ignored or downplayed Hammerfell whenever possible, acknowledging that a human nation fighting alone had defeated Dominion forces contradicted the story of inevitable Mer supremacy. Official explanations characterized the Hammerfell operations as a strategic withdrawal to consolidate more valuable territories. But soldiers who had fought there, and citizens who had lived through the failed occupation, knew better. The Dominion had committed significant resources to holding Hammerfell and been forced out through determined resistance. What Hammerfell demonstrated was not just military capability, but something more fundamental about how to resist totalitarian expansion. The Red Guards fought with knowledge of their own terrain, using mobility and guerrilla tactics that negated Dominion advantages in formal battlefield engagements. They maintained supply lines through routes the Thalmor could not effectively blockade. They accepted losses and territorial concessions as part of a longer strategy, rather than seeking decisive confrontations they could not win. Most importantly, they maintained unity when the Thalmor expected internal divisions to fragment their resistance. The Alikar warriors who drove Dominion forces back across the border carried that victory as evidence that determination could overcome apparent superiority. The cost had been measured in thousands of dead, in cities reduced to rubble, in an economy that would take decades to fully recover. But they had kept their sovereignty. They had proven that saying no to the Thalmor and making that refusal stick was possible for those willing to pay the price. The Dominion learned lessons from Hammerfell as well, though not the ones their opponents might have hoped. Thalmor's strategic analysis of the campaign focused on identifying what had gone wrong from their perspective: insufficient intelligence on Red Guard capabilities, underestimation of how terrain would impact supply logistics, failure to exploit internal Hammerfell political divisions effectively. These became case studies in their military academies, examples of mistakes that must not be repeated in future campaigns. Black Marsh represented a different kind of problem for Thalmor ambitions. The Argonians had repelled the Oblivion Crisis not through closing gates, but through invading Oblivion itself, pouring into the lands of Mehrunes Dagon with such ferocity that the Daedric forces retreated and sealed their own gates to stop the incursion. This was a level of organized aggression that suggested capabilities few outsiders understood. The swamps of Black Marsh had consumed every army that tried to conquer them throughout history. The Thalmor had no illusions about their ability to occupy that territory even if they wanted to. The Anaxalil, the faction controlling much of Black Marsh in the Fourth Era, pursued policies of extreme Argonian nationalism that made the Thalmor look moderate by comparison. They had purged non-Argonians from much of their territory. They had invaded and occupied significant portions of Morrowind after Red Mountain erupted. They were isolationist, xenophobic, and possessed of military strength that remained difficult to assess, because they allowed so few outsiders to observe it. The Thalmor and Ansalil regarded each other with mutual suspicion, but neither saw advantage in direct confrontation. Morrowind itself lay broken after the Red Mountain eruption and subsequent Argonian invasion. The once great Dunmer civilization had been reduced to desperate survivors clinging to what remained of their ancestral lands. They posed no threat to anyone and needed no attention from the Dominion beyond ensuring they stayed weak. The Thalmor occasionally sent observers to document the extent of the collapse, gathering intelligence on how thoroughly a major power could be destroyed through combination of natural disaster and external assault. High Rock remained technically part of the Empire, but its internal divisions and complicated political landscape made it questionable how much actual imperial authority existed there. The Brescian kingdoms competed with each other as much as they cooperated. Orsinium maintained its precarious existence surrounded by neighbors who would happily see it destroyed again. The region was fragmented enough that projecting power there would be difficult for anyone, but it also meant the Brescians were unlikely to mount unified resistance to Dominion expansion if the Thalmor decided the territory was worth the effort. These geopolitical realities created a Tamriel where the next great war would not be a simple rematch of the last one. Multiple powers with their own agendas existed alongside the primary Imperial Dominion rivalry. Alliances that seemed obvious on maps might prove impossible to forge given historical enmities and cultural differences. The Thalmor had to consider not just how to defeat the Empire, but how to manage a complex web of potential threats and opportunities across the entire continent. The strategic planning happening in Thalm, command centers in Alinor, involved scenarios that accounted for these complications. If they invaded Cyrodiil again, would Hammerfell intervene or see it as an opportunity to remain safely neutral? If they pushed into Skyrim, would the Nords unite against external invasion, or would the wounds of the Civil War keep them divided? Could the Anixilil be provoked into attacking Imperial territories, creating a two-front war that would split Legion resources? These questions shaped military preparations that continued even during the period of nominal peace following the Great War. The Empire engaged in similar calculations from its position of relative weakness. Rebuilding the Legion required time and resources the provinces struggled to provide. Recruiting sufficient soldiers meant convincing young men and women to join an institution that had recently been defeated and forced into humiliating concessions. Training those recruits to the standards necessary to face Dominion forces required experienced officers, many of whom had died at the Red Ring or in the grinding attrition of the campaigns in Hammerfell and Cyrodiil. Imperial intelligence services worked to understand Thalmor capabilities and intentions with limited success. The Dominion maintained operational security that made penetrating their decision-making processes nearly impossible. Agents sent to Somerset rarely returned, and when they did, their information was often outdated or deliberately misleading. The Thalmor embassy in Skyrim was a known intelligence hub, but assaulting it would violate the Concordat and provide justification for renewed war before the Empire was ready. Both sides understood that the peace would not last. The Concordat had been a temporary arrangement born of mutual exhaustion rather than genuine resolution of the underlying conflicts. The Empire needed time to recover strength. The Dominion needed time to consolidate control over territories gained and prepare for campaigns that would finish what the Great War had started. The question was not whether fighting would resume, but when and under what circumstances. Into this carefully balanced tension between recovering empires came something that neither Thalmor planners nor Imperial strategists had predicted or could fully account for. In 4E201, dragons returned to Skyrim. Alduin the World Eater, firstborn of Akatosh, emerged from the flow of time itself with apocalyptic intent. The prophecies that scholars had treated as mythology suddenly manifested as creatures of fire and destruction, burning their way across the northern province. The return of dragons represented a category of threat that existed beyond normal military or political calculations. These were not armies that could be outmaneuvered or defeated through superior tactics. They were physical embodiments of concepts from the beginning of time, beings that had shaped the world when it was young. The Thu'um that the Thalmor had worked to suppress was suddenly revealed as not just cultural tradition but practical necessity, the only reliable method mortals possessed for combating draconic power. The Dragonborn appeared in this moment of crisis, like an answer to a prayer that no one remembered making. The last Dragonborn, prophesied in texts that predated the current Kalpa, emerged with the power to absorb dragon souls and use the Thu'um with strength that matched the dragons themselves. This was not political power or military force. This was metaphysical significance, operating at a level that made conventional authority structures irrelevant. The Thalmor had no effective response to the Dragonborn. Their intelligence networks could track movements and gather information, but that meant nothing when confronting someone who existed partially outside normal causality. Their military forces could observe dragon battles, but could not participate meaningfully when the combat happened in the language of creation itself. Their political influence evaporated when facing an individual whose authority came from sources far older and more fundamental than anything the Dominion represented. The implications terrified Thalmor leadership in ways they struggled to articulate even in classified communications. Their entire cosmological theory rested on the idea that they could control or at least predict the major forces shaping Tamriel. The towers could be studied, understood, potentially destroyed through long-term planning. But the Dragonborn was something else entirely, a manifestation of Akatosh acting through mortal form to address threats to creation itself. This suggested the universe had defensive mechanisms against exactly the kind of cosmic unmaking the Thalmor sought to achieve. Achelin was destroyed by the Dragonborn on the throat of the world, and then again in Sovngarde itself, ended in ways that most mortals could barely comprehend. The World Eater, who should have consumed all of creation, was instead consumed by someone carrying the soul of a dragon in mortal flesh. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The immediate crisis was resolved. But what remained afterward was a variable that disrupted every careful calculation about how the future would unfold. The Dragonborn continued to exist after Alduin fell. The powers that individual wielded did not diminish with the completion of their prophesied role. They could shout dragons from the sky. They could move through time at the time wound. They had walked in Sovngarde and returned. They possessed Elder Scrolls and understood their secrets. They were simultaneously mortal and something far more, a walking contradiction that made mockery of Thalmor's certainty about the boundaries between human limitation and divine power. Worse still, from the Thalmor perspective, the Dragonborn represented a rebuttal to their fundamental ideology. The Altmer claimed that mortality was a prison, and divine ascension required returning to a state before Mundus existed. Yet here stood a mortal who had touched divinity without unmaking creation, who possessed power rivaling the gods while remaining part of the world rather than separate from it. This was the possibility that Talus represented scaled to undeniable immediate presence. Thalmor agents in Skyrim filed reports about the Dragonborn with increasing desperation in their tone. They recommended assassination, but acknowledged they had no reliable method to accomplish it. They suggested diplomatic overtures, but recognized someone who had defeated the World Eater had no reason to negotiate with mortals, pursuing political agendas. They proposed waiting to see what the Dragonborn would do next, which was admission that they had lost initiative and control over events in fundamental ways. The broader question was what the emergence of the Dragonborn meant for Tamriel beyond the immediate dragon crisis. Prophecy suggested that such figures appeared when the world faced existential threats. Alduin had been one such threat. But if the universe produced champions specifically to counter apocalyptic dangers, what did that say about Thalm or plans to unmake reality? Were they simply another form of dragon, another force of destruction that would inevitably call forth a response they could not overcome? The metaphysical implications troubled even Thalmor scholars who spent their lives studying such matters. If Akatosh, or something like Akatosh, was actively defending creation, then the tower theory might be fundamentally flawed. Perhaps the towers were not the only thing holding reality together. Perhaps there were deeper structures, older powers, forces that would resist unmaking with strength proportional to the threat. The Dragonborn suggested that reality itself might be fighting back against those who sought to destroy it. This introduced uncertainty into planning that had previously operated with absolute conviction. The Thalmor had believed they understood the rules governing existence and were working systematically to exploit those rules toward their goals. Now they confronted evidence that their understanding might be incomplete, that there were factors they had not accounted for, that the universe was more actively hostile to their agenda than they had assumed. Uncertainty is poison to ideological movements built on certainty. Yet acknowledging these doubts openly would undermine everything the Thalmor represented. Their authority rested on claims of superior knowledge and understanding. Admitting that a single mortal had disrupted their entire cosmological framework would invite questions about what else they might be wrong about. So the official position became that the Dragonborn was an anomaly, an interesting development but not something that changed the fundamental trajectory of their plans. Individual Thalmor, who had actually studied the evidence, came to different conclusions in private. Some saw the Dragonborn as a warning that they were approaching dangers they did not fully comprehend. Others interpreted it as confirmation that the current Kalpa was ending, and the emergence of such figures was part of the natural cycle they sought to accelerate and control. The debates happened behind closed doors, where ideological deviation would not be publicly visible. The Dragonborn, for their part, existed in a space beyond the normal conflicts consuming Tamriel. Whether they chose to involve themselves in the Imperial Dominion struggle, or the Skyrim Civil War, or any other political matter was entirely up to them. Their power made conventional authority irrelevant. They could walk into the Thalmor embassy, and no one could stop them. They could challenge Ulfric, or Tullius, or the Emperor himself, and the outcome would be predetermined. They were a force of nature wearing mortal shape. What this meant for the future depended entirely on choices not yet made. The Dragonborn could reshape Tamriel or simply walk away from its problems. They could oppose the Thalmor directly, or ignore them as beneath notice. They existed outside the normal constraints that channeled mortal action into predictable patterns, and that made them the single variable that neither side in the coming conflicts could account for with any confidence. The world was moving toward another great conflict, despite the presence of this unpredictable power. The Empire had used the years since the Concordat to rebuild as much as resources allowed. New legions were trained, fortifications were strengthened, alliances were explored with kingdoms that might join against the Dominion. The preparations were inadequate, given the scale of the threat, but they were better than the state of collapse that had existed immediately after the Great War. The Dominion had used the same years to shore up control over their territories and develop military capabilities that learned from previous mistakes. Their intelligence suggested the Empire was still weak enough that the next war could finish the conquest that the first had left incomplete. But they also recognized that multiple factors made the timing uncertain. Imperial strength was recovering. Potential complications existed with other powers like Hammerfell or the unpredictable situation in Skyrim. And the Dragonborn represented a wild card that could not be safely ignored. Flashpoints existed across the continent where renewed conflict could ignite. Skyrim remained contested, officially imperial, but with Stormcloak forces still controlling significant territory, depending on how the Civil War had resolved. Hammerfell stood independent and militarily capable, potentially willing to ally with the Empire against shared enemies if approached correctly. The border regions ceded to the Dominion under the Concordat festered with resentment that could fuel insurgencies. The younger generation on both sides of the Imperial Dominion divide had grown up knowing only hatred and propaganda about the other. Imperial children learned about Thalmor torture chambers and the occupation of their capital city. Dominion youth were taught that humans were primitives who had usurped authority that rightfully belonged to Myr. Neither side understood the other as people rather than symbols of everything wrong with the world. This generational hatred ensured that even if current leaders sought genuine peace, their successors would likely resume the conflict. The question of what victory would actually look like had become muddled over years of escalation and atrocity. The Empire fighting to survive could claim victory if it simply continued to exist and maintained independence from Dominion control. But that defensive goal offered little hope for the millions living under Thalmor authority, who might look to the Empire for liberation that would never come if Imperial strategy remained purely defensive. The Dominion sought complete victory, the subjugation or destruction of the Empire, and the establishment of mere supremacy across all Tamriel. But even achieving that would only be a step toward their ultimate metaphysical goals, and if those goals were real rather than impossible delusion, then conventional victory or defeat became meaningless compared to the stakes of either succeeding or failing to unmake reality itself. Prophecy suggested possibilities beyond the binary of empire or dominion triumph. Ancient texts spoke of cycles, of ages ending and new eras beginning in ways that made the ambitions of mortal empires seem small. The return of dragons and the dragonborn pointed towards something larger happening beneath the surface conflicts. Perhaps both the Empire and Dominion were wrong. Perhaps the real threat to Tamriel came from directions neither was watching. The Daedric princes remained active and interested in mortal affairs. Mehrunes Dagon had invaded once and been repelled. Nothing prevented another prince from attempting something similar, or something more subtle. The barriers between Oblivion and Mundus had been breached before. They could be breached again. And while empires fought each other over territory and ideology, the forces beyond reality waited for opportunities that mortal conflicts inevitably created. A Kabir existed across the sea, a continent of mysteries and threats that had invaded Tamriel multiple times throughout history. The Tazesi had nearly conquered the continent during previous eras. Nothing suggested they had lost interest in expansion. If they saw Tamriel weakened by internal conflict, another invasion was possible. That would force both Empire and Dominion to either cooperate against external threat or face conquest by something neither could handle alone. The weight of history suggested that no single war, no single conflict would determine the ultimate fate of Tamriel. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires conquered and crumbled. What seemed inevitable in one era became forgotten history in the next. The Thalmor believed they were working toward an endpoint, a final resolution where mortality itself would be transcended. But history had a way of continuing past points where people thought it should end. The truth behind the Thalmor, that few wanted to acknowledge, was that they were simultaneously more and less dangerous than conventional analysis suggested. They were more dangerous because their goals really were apocalyptic, and they possessed both the knowledge and commitment to potentially achieve them. They were less dangerous because that same extremism contained the seeds of their failure. Movements built on destroying the world tend to generate resistance from everyone who would prefer the world continue existing. Understanding the Thalmor required seeing them as neither invincible nor impotent, but as a force operating with real power and genuine limitations. They had conquered nations and terrorized populations and pursued goals that should have been impossible. But they had also been defeated, driven back, forced to compromise. They operated within constraints imposed by logistics and politics, and the fundamental fact that even with divine ambitions they remained mortal beings subject to mortal limitations. The inevitability of renewed conflict hangs over Tamriel like storm clouds gathering on a horizon that everyone can see but no one can prevent. The peace established by the white gold concordat was always temporary, a bandage over wounds too deep to heal through simple passage of time. Both the Empire and the Dominion understand that the question is not whether they will fight again, but when the circumstances align to make resumption of hostilities strategically viable for one side or the other. The Empire has spent the decades since the Great War attempting to rebuild strength from a position of structural weakness. The legions exist, but at reduced numbers compared to their Third Era peak. Recruitment remains challenging when service means potentially facing Dominion forces that have already proven they can occupy the Imperial City itself. The provinces that should provide soldiers and resources are themselves struggling with internal problems that make supporting the central authority difficult. Skyrim's situation exemplifies the Empire's broader challenges. Even if the Civil War has been resolved through Imperial victory or negotiated peace, the underlying tensions remain. The Nords who fought for Ulfric do not suddenly embrace loyalty to an empire that banned their most sacred religious practices. The Nords who fought for the Empire do not forget that their neighbors took up arms against them. The scars run deep enough that unifying Skyrim into an effective fighting force against external enemies would require healing that takes generations rather than years. High Rock maintains nominal imperial allegiance, but the Breton kingdoms pursue their own agendas with limited coordination. Hammerfell stands independent, its relationship with the Empire complicated by bitterness over being abandoned to fight the Dominion alone. Cyrodiil itself has recovered physically from the Great War, but the psychological trauma of occupation lingers. The citizens remember Thalmor soldiers in their streets. They remember what happened to those accused of Talos worship. Trust in imperial protection has been damaged in ways that cannot be repaired through speeches or propaganda. The Dominion faces its own challenges, despite appearances of monolithic strength. The Great War cost them casualties that propaganda minimized but strategic planners could not ignore. The Altmer population that provides the core of their military and administrative apparatus is not infinite. Every soldier killed at the Red Ring or during the Hammerfell campaigns represents resources that take decades to replace given mere lifespans and birth rates. The subject territories within the Dominion remain less than enthusiastic about their absorption into Thalmor-controlled civilization. Valenwood complies because the alternatives are worse. But Bosmer cultural identity has not been erased simply because they now answer to administrators from Somerset. The Khajiit of elsewhere harbor doubts that grow stronger as memories of the Void Knights fade and younger generations question the official narrative about who actually restored the moons. The Thalmor intelligence networks that monitor these subject populations require constant maintenance and resources. The justiciars stationed across imperial territories to enforce the Talos ban are vulnerable targets for resistance movements that are growing bolder as memories of imperial defeat fade. Every agent lost represents training and expertise that cannot be quickly replaced. The Dominion projects an image of inevitability, but beneath that facade operates an empire that must work constantly to maintain control. Both sides seek advantages that might tip the balance when fighting resumes. The Empire explores diplomatic overtures to powers that might join against the Dominion. A formal alliance with Hammerfell would add experienced desert warriors who have already proven they can defeat Thalmor forces. Negotiations with High Rock kingdoms might secure their northern flank. Even approaching the Anexillo about coordinated action against Dominion interests has been quietly discussed. Despite the vast cultural and political gulfs separating Imperial and Argonian worldviews, the Dominion pursues similar alliance building while working to isolate the Empire diplomatically. They offer trade agreements and mutual defense pacts to minor kingdoms that might be swayed toward neutrality or even support. They fund insurgent movements in Imperial territories, providing weapons and training to anyone willing to fight against Legion authority. They cultivate relationships with Daedric cultists and other groups operating outside conventional power structures, seeing them as useful chaos agents, even if ideologically unreliable. The strategic landscape has become vastly more complex than the relatively straightforward Imperial Dominion confrontation of the Great War. Multiple powers with independent capabilities exist across Tamriel now. The assumption that a second Great War would simply be a larger version of the first fails to account for how the intervening decades have transformed who holds power and what they might do with it. Hammerfell represents the most significant wildcard in these calculations. The Red Guards defeated the Dominion when the Empire could not. They did so independently, proving that resistance to Thalmor expansion succeeds when populations commit to paying the necessary price. If the Empire and Hammerfell reconciled their differences and coordinated military planning, the combined force would present challenges the Dominion could not easily overcome. But that reconciliation requires trust that was destroyed when the Empire signed the Concordat and ceded Hammerfell territory. The younger generation coming of age across Tamriel will determine much about how the next conflict unfolds. They have grown up in the shadow of the Great War, hearing stories that shaped their understanding of the world before they had memories of their own. Imperial youth know the Thalmor as monsters who tortured and killed for sport during the occupation. Dominion youth know humans as primitives who must be subjugated or destroyed to prevent them from contaminating the world with their weakness and chaos. These young people will fill the armies that fight the next war. They will make the decisions about whether to compromise or escalate. They carry hatreds instilled by parents and teachers, and the cultural narratives that surrounded them since birth. The possibility of genuine peace between the Empire and Dominion shrinks with each generation that knows only enmity, rather than the complicated coexistence that characterized earlier eras. Technology and magical development continue to advance on both sides, driven by military necessity and the understanding that whoever achieves breakthrough advantages in warfare will shape the next conflict. The Empire invests in developing weapons and tactics that counter Dominion's strengths. The Thalmor pursue magical research that builds on their already formidable capabilities. Each side seeks the innovation that will prove decisive when battles are fought. The Dwemer ruins scattered across Tamriel have become sites of intensive investigation by both sides. The lost civilization left behind artifacts and technologies that modern scholars barely understand but recognize as potentially powerful. Whoever unlocks Dwemer's secrets might gain access to weapons or defenses that change the fundamental nature of warfare. Both Imperial and Dominion research teams excavate these sites with urgency that sometimes leads to conflict when they encounter each other in the depths. The Elder Scrolls themselves remain sources of potential advantage for those willing to risk madness to read them. These artifacts of prophecy and possibility offer glimpses of futures that might be avoided or embraced depending on choices not yet made. Both sides maintain scholars attempting to extract useful intelligence from the scrolls despite the personal cost to those who study them. The knowledge gained is fragmentary and often contradictory, but even hints about what might come can inform strategic planning. Natural disasters and supernatural events continue to shape the world in ways that neither military planning nor diplomatic maneuvering can control. Red Mountain erupted once, and could erupt again. The Dragon Crisis proved that ancient threats can return without warning. Other forces from myth and legend might manifest when least expected. The assumption that the next great conflict will be determined by conventional armies facing each other on battlefields might prove naive if reality itself continues to destabilize. The possibility exists that both the Empire and Dominion are fighting yesterday's war while preparing for tomorrow's. They focus on each other because their enmity is known and their capabilities can be assessed. But the real threat to Tamriel might emerge from quarters neither is watching. The Daedric princes pursue their own inscrutable agendas. Akavir might decide the time is right for another invasion. Forces from beyond the known world could appear and render the Imperial Dominion conflict irrelevant compared to survival against something neither can defeat alone. Prophecy and legend speak of cycles, of ages ending in fire and new eras emerging from ash. The current Kalpa has existed for thousands of years, but nothing suggests it will last forever. The Thalmor certainly believe it should not, given their explicit goal of unmaking the current reality. But other prophecies speak of different endings, different transformations that have nothing to do with Altmer ambitions. to reclaim lost divinity. The universe might have its own plans that care nothing for what mortals want. The Dragonborn remains the most immediate example of how prophecy manifests in ways that disrupt all careful planning. Their continued existence after fulfilling their role against Alduin suggests that perhaps their purpose extends beyond that single confrontation. Perhaps they were called into being to address multiple threats, with the dragons merely the first and most obvious. If so, then both the Empire and Dominion might find themselves subject to intervention from someone who operates according to different rules than those governing conventional power. The question of what victory actually means has become philosophical rather than simply strategic. If the Empire defeats the Dominion, what does that achieve beyond survival? The Thalmor ideology will not disappear simply because their political structure is destroyed. The Almur who genuinely believe in the restoration of their divine heritage will continue pursuing those goals through other means. Military victory might simply transform the conflict into something harder to fight, a resistance movement rather than conventional war. If the Dominion conquers the Empire, they face the problem of occupying a continent of humans who will never accept Mer supremacy willingly. The resources required to garrison and control that much hostile territory would be enormous. And even if they somehow achieved complete conquest, the ultimate goal of unmaking reality would still require destroying the towers and overcoming whatever defenses existence itself might muster against annihilation. Conventional military victory would only be the beginning of their true struggle. The possibility exists for neither side to win in any meaningful sense. Wars of this scale and duration often end in exhaustion rather than triumph, with all parties damaged beyond their ability to continue fighting, regardless of which territories they hold when the killing finally stops. Tamriel might emerge from the Second Great War as a shattered landscape of failed empires and devastated populations, vulnerable to threats that healthy civilizations could have resisted. The most optimistic scenario involves somehow breaking the cycle of escalation before it reaches the point of mutual destruction. This would require leadership on both sides willing to compromise, populations willing to set aside justified hatreds, and circumstances that make peace more attractive than continued conflict. The historical precedents for such transformations are rare. Most wars of ideology and survival end only when one side is destroyed or both are too broken to continue. The world stands balanced between futures that range from cautious hope to absolute catastrophe. The choices made in the coming years by leaders and common citizens alike will determine which path Tamriel follows. Those choices will be shaped by fear and pride and memory and all the complicated factors that drive human and Merce behavior when confronted with threats, both real and imagined. The story is not finished. The ending has not been written. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most terrifying truth of all. In the final analysis, the Thalmor represents something more universal than simply one political faction in one era of history. They are an example of what happens when conviction becomes fanaticism, when pride curdles into supremacy, when fear of mortality drives people to embrace apocalypse rather than accept limitation. They demonstrate how movements can begin with legitimate grievances and real suffering, then transform into something monstrous through slow incremental steps that each seem justified in isolation. The tragedy of the Thalmor is not that they are evil in some simple cartoonish sense. It is that they are Mer who believe absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. They genuinely think they are saving their people, reclaiming stolen divinity, correcting an ancient injustice. The fact that their salvation requires destroying the world and killing everyone who disagrees is in their minds merely the price of achieving something sacred. This is not madness in the clinical sense. It is ideology taken to its ultimate conclusion without any break of doubt or empathy. Understanding this makes the Thalmor more rather than less dangerous. Enemies motivated by simple greed or power hunger can be negotiated with, bribed, deterred. Enemies who believe they are fulfilling divine purpose will sacrifice everything, including themselves, to achieve their goals. They cannot be reasoned with, because reason operates from different premises than faith. They cannot be threatened because death is preferable to abandoning what they see as sacred duty. The lesson the Thalmor offer to those willing to see it is about how societies slide into extremism. It happens through crisis that creates fear, through fear that becomes resentment, through resentment that crystallizes into hatred, through hatred that justifies atrocity, through atrocity that requires even greater atrocity to justify the previous crimes. Each step seems small, necessary, temporary, but the path leads inexorably toward darkness if no one has the courage to step off it. The Altmer before the Oblivion Crisis were not monsters. They were a proud people with legitimate concerns about maintaining their culture and identity. The Thalmor who rose during the crisis were not initially genocidal fanatics. They were activists who believed they had solutions to real problems. The transformation from that starting point to torture chambers and plans for universal destruction happened through hundreds of small compromises with conscience, each of which seemed justified in the moment by the greater good being pursued. This is how tyranny always emerges, wearing the mask of salvation. It promises to restore what was lost, to punish those responsible for suffering, to create a better world through whatever means necessary. It identifies enemies who must be destroyed for the good of all. It demands absolute loyalty, and treats doubt as betrayal. It justifies present horror through promised future glory. And by the time people realize what they have created, they are too complicit to turn back without confronting their own guilt. The parallels to other movements throughout history, both in Tamriel and beyond, need not be spelled out explicitly. Those who study such patterns will recognize them. The specific details change, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. Fear plus pride plus certainty equals catastrophe given enough time and power to implement the vision. The Thalmor are not unique, except in the specific form their ideology takes. The impulse they represent appears again and again across cultures and eras. Yet the story also contains hope in the spaces between the horrors. Not everyone follows the descent into extremism. Some resist even when resistance seems futile. Some maintain their humanity and compassion even when surrounded by those who have abandoned both. The Altmer within Somerset, who quietly help those targeted by the Thalmor, demonstrate that culture and cruelty are not identical. The soldiers who question orders demonstrate that following commands has limits. The scholars who seek truth rather than propaganda demonstrate that knowledge can resist being weaponized. The existence of these resistors matters even when they cannot stop what is happening. They prove that the Thalmor path is not inevitable, that choices remain available even in the darkest circumstances. They maintain the possibility that Altmer society might eventually turn away from the abyss it currently peers into. They keep alive the memory that there were other ways to respond to crisis besides embracing apocalypse. The future remains unwritten despite all the forces pushing toward particular outcomes. The Thalmor believe they know how history will unfold because they have studied prophecy and tower theory, and convinced themselves they understand the mechanics of reality. But prophecy is treacherous and reality more complicated than theories suggest. The universe has already demonstrated through the Dragonborn that it produces responses to threats that careful planning cannot anticipate. What remains certain is that the story of the Thalmor has not reached its conclusion. They continue to exist, to plan, to pursue their ultimate goals with patient determination that spans decades and centuries. The Empire continues to prepare for conflict it knows is coming. The various kingdoms and powers across Tamriel continue their own agendas that might align with or oppose either side. The pieces move across the board toward configurations that will determine who lives, who dies, and whether the world itself continues to exist. For those living through this era, the weight of that uncertainty must be nearly unbearable. To know that apocalyptic forces are moving in the shadows while being powerless to stop them. To understand that the next war will determine not just which empire dominates, but potentially whether reality persists in its current form. To see the people around you divided between those who do not understand the danger and those who understand too well and have fallen into despair. Yet life continues despite looming catastrophe. People fall in love and raise children. They plant crops and build homes. They create art and tell stories. They laugh and mourn and struggle with all the ordinary challenges of existence, even while knowing that everything might end tomorrow. This persistence in the face of potential annihilation is perhaps the most powerful resistance to the Thalmor vision. They want to unmake the world because they see mortal life as a prison. But mortals who embrace life despite its pain and limitation prove that the prison might actually be a home worth defending. The dark truth behind the Thalmor is ultimately this. They are dangerous not because they are strong, but because they are certain. They are tragic, not because they are evil, but because they believe they are righteous. They are terrifying, not because they might succeed, but because they are willing to destroy everything if success proves impossible. They represent the shadow side of conviction, the cost of certainty taken to extremes, the destination that lies at the end of roads paved with good intentions and absolute faith. In the annals of Tamriel, the Thalmor will be remembered not as gods reclaiming their birthright, but as Mer who believed their own lies so deeply they nearly dragged all of creation into the void with them. Their story is not finished. Neither is ours. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all, that such certainty, such purity of purpose, such willingness to sacrifice everything for a dream of divinity could emerge again, wearing different faces, speaking different words, but following the same ancient path toward oblivion. The choice facing everyone who hears this tale is whether to recognize those patterns when they begin emerging again, whether to step back from the abyss when it opens beneath your feet, whether to question certainty, even when certainty feels safer than doubt. The Thalmor offer a warning written in blood and suffering across centuries. Whether that warning is heeded or ignored will determine if their legacy becomes a tragedy that was or a tragedy that will be. You have been listening to Loreforge, where every legend leaves a scar. Until the next tale unfolds, travelers, rest well, and remember that the truest histories are written by those brave enough to question them. The fires of the past still burn in the present. The choices made tomorrow shape the world that comes after. Sleep now, but do not forget. The story continues whether we watch or not. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply remember that darkness always claims it brings the light,